Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Find out archive episodes at YouTube and search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. We have a channel there with all previous episodes, and learn more about us, the Tuesday Morning Group Coalition, especially as we approach January's very different General Assembly. What's coming up? Joining us now from American Commitment, their president, Phil Kerpen. Welcome back to the program, Phil. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Oh, so far so good, but then the General Assembly hasn't convened yet. So I guess, we just hold our breath and
you're going to have a heck of a session coming up with the Democrats running the show.
I don't know where to begin with that, but I want to begin with the piece you wrote on the Green Act. And I know we've heard a lot about the Green New Deal. So while everyone's been worried about Second Amendment grabs, this looks like more crony capitalism going on here. Tell us about the Green Act and why your column calls on the president to veto it.
Well, we try to focus on the threats to limited government and economic freedom that are sort of on the margin that could go either way. And so while we did blast the Green New Deal, that's not in any imminent danger of being enacted, whereas this grab bag of special interest green tax provisions that was written in the Ways and Means Committee, it's a very real and immediate threat because you've got Democratic leadership in both the House and Senate, Pelosi and Schumer, that want some or all of these provisions to be put into a year-end tax extenders bill or possibly even attached to the government funding bill. And remember, the current government funding bill ends on December 20th, which is designed to exert maximum pressure under fear of shutdown right before Christmas to potentially pass all kinds of things, either as part of the government spending bill or sort of in a sidecar potential tax bill. And so we have to take very seriously the provisions that Democrats are talking about including in that, because if it's in a year-end package, it's very hard to stop because, you don't want to pay the troops and all that kind of thing, and potentially you get a presidential signature that way. And so we take this as a very real and serious threat. And if you look at this bill, it's got sort of all of the greatest hits of, corrupt green energy giveaways, another 5-year extension of the wind production tax credit, another 5-year extension of the solar investment tax credit. It revives the biodiesel blenders credit, which ended 2 years ago, and gives it retroactively all the money for the last 2 years.
Jeez.
And it saves Tesla and General Motors from the phase-out of the electric vehicle tax credit, because that tax credit's supposed to be only for 200,000 vehicles sold per manufacturer. They're both now over that number, so this Democrat bill would triple it to 600,000. And for the first time allow a federal tax credit for buying used electric vehicles. By the way, more than half of the benefit of the electric vehicle tax credit goes to just 2 states, New York and California,
of course,
which happens to be where Schumer and Pelosi are from. And, of course, it mostly goes to rich people, but that's the tax break for the rich that they really like because it's their rich people. And then, insult to injury, the most insane thing in this bill is tax credits for universities. And they don't pay taxes, so to style this a tax credit is almost comically dishonest.
Yes.
But $5 billion to colleges and universities in grants for their environmental justice programs, whatever that is. It probably just means left-wing activism. $5 billion with a B dollars. That's $1 billion a year for 5 years for environmental justice programs at colleges and universities.
Yeah, so our college kids can get indoctrinated into the idea that somehow the environment is racist.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yes, correct. I think that's right.
Phil, now, has this got any Republicans, or is this because it's being done as the CR is approaching? And I've been told by members of Congress that they're probably going to ramrod this right in with the impeachment votes and do some horse trading on perhaps the North American trade agreement replacements. So there may actually wind up being Republicans voting for stuff like this. Are they even aware, or is this another one of Nancy's, we have to vote for it before we know what's in it?
Well, the biodiesel credit which is another one of these corrupt corporate welfare giveaways, mostly benefits one state, Iowa, which happens to be the home state of the Republican chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Chuck Grassley. And so I do think there is some considerable risk that one or more of these other obscene provisions may be traded in a deal for the biodiesel ripoff as a way to attract Senate Republican support or acquiescence from the chairman to put in a package, which then would be difficult to stop. And so I don't know that they'll get all of these things, but I fear that they could get some of them and as a trade-off for another program I'm against, the corporate welfare program for the biodiesel industry, which Chairman Grassley really wants.
Well, and all of these handouts are for organizations and companies and businesses that are non-profitable without government subsidy. I found it interesting. One of the first things you were talking about, these wind subsidies for companies that they go out and supposedly pillory on the stump, like Dominion Energy.
Well, the wind production tax credit is maybe the worst designed of all of these programs because it's related to production. You get a fixed dollar amount for each kilowatt that you sell in. And so what happens in a lot of these markets where there's a lot of wind in places like Texas and Kansas is what happens is when the wind is blowing hard, they're actually able to sell wind energy into the grid at a negative spot price because of how much money they get from federal taxpayers. They can still make money when they sell at a negative spot price. And so you have these incidents where when the wind is blowing hard, all of the electricity producers in that market are losing money because of the wind guys selling so low or even at a negative price that, if you're running a coal or a nuclear plant, you really can't shut down. You can ramp down, but you can't shut down and then restart. So the conventional energy sources are taking losses when the wind is blowing. But when the wind is not blowing, they've got to pick up for the slack capacity. They've got to make up the difference. And so you get these incredible swings, which have been really, really detrimental to investment and reliability of electricity in these markets. So even if we wanted to subsidize wind, which I don't, I think after 25 years it should stand on its own merit, especially because every couple of years they tell us, oh, this is the last extension, and then we'll be able to compete on the merits. Even if you wanted to subsidize them, it should be like a fixed dollar amount. It should not be tied to production the way it is, which creates these really perverse effects in electricity markets. And yet, for some reason, every few years they just extend it because of the lobbying power of the wind guys and the natural gas guys, because what tends to happen is whenever you build wind capacity, you have to also build natural gas backup, and what they tend to build are natural gas peaking units, which are much less efficient than if you had just built a combined cycle natural gas plant in the first place. You get less efficient natural gas to run for when the wind isn't blowing, and so the gas guys sell more gas with wind than they do with gas plants, is the other sort of bizarre aspect of this. And so the natural gas lobbyists also support extensions of the wind subsidies for that reason.
And again, it's one of these things I can hear somebody touting the bipartisan nature of the support for things like this. Meanwhile, we all go broke in the process. Phil, what is your sense at American Commitment as to whether the president would be willing to veto a continuing resolution, a spending bill that would essentially, I can hear Schumer already ramping up the Trump shutdown rhetoric if stuff like this is tacked on?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that it's questionable because remember the first time he signed one of these huge omnibus bills, he did it with General Mattis standing next to him, and he said, I hate this bill, I hate that I have to sign it, but I've got to fund the troops, and I'll never do it again. And then he did it again. So right. I don't know. Look, I think that the president wouldn't want to, but at the same time, the same sort of logic would apply, right? I mean, the one time he was willing to go to a government shutdown at the beginning of this calendar year, it was because the defense part the defense appropriations bill had already been passed, and so that wasn't at risk in the shutdown. It was a partial shutdown. He was more comfortable with doing that. I think that with defense in the mix, he's much less likely to be willing to veto, and so it becomes very important to keep these unrelated, special interest provisions off in the Senate and not to rely on the president as a backstop. That said, at least a veto threat would make them think twice about putting it in, and I think that would be helpful.
Is this also part and parcel, Phil, the fruit of the fact that I think Tom Perriello was Virginia's 5th District Congressman. The last time an actual federal budget was put together by the
House. A long time. Yeah, I don't know. Exactly,
and we're just continuing to add 5% onto what was determined in 2009.
It's pretty clear that the federal budget process is severely broken. They never do it in the actual process that's laid out in the 74 Budget Act. They always end up rolling them into these omnibuses or continuing resolutions, or a continuing resolution then an omnibus. And they always wait until forcing events of deadlines, of shutdowns, or we need to get home for Christmas and that kind of thing. And it's not conducive to good policy making. Everyone across the political spectrum should want a budget process where we actually set priorities and then meet them, instead of this constant scrambling to have deadlines and shutdowns and all this kind of thing. And I really like the bill that Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin has put forward, which would end all shutdowns and just have an automatic extension of any appropriations that aren't passed in time, and so we could take the shutdown risk off the table and sort of take the forced deadline approach out, and then maybe without that hanging over our heads, get back to kind of fixing a process and figuring out something that actually works. But the way we've been doing it, it's not very effective, and it always creates this risk that totally unrelated stuff can be crammed in there, and that's a real danger. And in particular, I think there's a real danger. I don't think they're going to get the $5 billion for environmental justice. I mean, I certainly hope they don't, but I think there's a real danger that they do. Let's say the electric vehicle credit and the biodiesel credit. Well, those would be two terrible taxpayer ripoffs, and I could see Republicans and Democrats easily agreeing on them. So we've got to get some pressure on this and say, whatever you do here at the end of the year, do it cleanly and don't stuff a bunch of ripoffs in there.
The president being somewhat of a wild card, I think the bull in the china shop gets overplayed sometimes, but certainly fair. What would he have to do? Because I think this continuing resolution fetish is just part and parcel of the U.S. House of Representatives' 25-year campaign of giving up their authority to the executive branch anyway, under this idea that A, we can get all the credit, and B, slough off all the blame onto the executive branch. What could he do parliamentarily to push this back into the laps of Congress and say, no, this is your hot potato. You need to come up with a budget or we're not going forward. Come up with some way to keep the military and the state parks and all the other things that they like to say open, but say that it's only going to last for 6 months and then it's going to run out, and there's nothing I can do to stop it from running out. You need to have a budget passed by then.
Well, there are only so many tools that he has. It's very hard to force people to do their job when they don't want to, when they keep punting, as you correctly point out. The shutdowns always tend to result in Republicans being blamed, whether they're in Congress or in the White House. I'm not sure that another one of those would be helpful, but I would like to see, sooner rather than later next year, a focus on pressuring Congress to get their fiscal work done, so that we don't, end up with what the most likely outcome is, which is they do a CR and go home to campaign for the elections and then punt it all into a lame duck session, which is when you get the worst outcomes of all. So I would like to see him really make an issue and try to create some political accountability, for Congress to get their fiscal work done next year rather than, punting it.
You mentioned Chuck Grassley. What about a guy like Mitch McConnell? What sort of role can the Senate play in this, since we do have two houses and one's GOP control, one's Democrat control? What can be done in the Senate to force this, maybe?
Well, the bills have to start in the House, the funding bills, but the Senate has a lot of power. And, at the end of the day, because of the way the Senate rules are with the 60-vote rule, the House usually ends up swallowing what the Senate will bear, because the Senate has to have some sort of a bipartisan deal to move something through. And so I think that, if McConnell can get some sort of agreement either with Schumer or pick off, 7 Democrats and get a deal going around Schumer, he'll be able to set the contours of what the year-end deal looks like, and the House, whether they like it or not, will have to swallow it. And so these things always come down to what can be negotiated in the Senate. The problem is, McConnell can't do it on his own. He needs 7 Democratic votes to get a bill through, and so that probably means some sort of a negotiated deal with Schumer. And Schumer has already said his number one priority in terms of these extender provisions is the electric vehicles. And so, it's going to be hard, I think, for McConnell to work a clean sort of end of the year here. But I think he just needs to really make the public case that, hey, we shouldn't be tying, funding for our troops to, extending any of these special interest provisions. And if there is going to be a tax extenders bill considered, it needs to be totally separate from the government funding question. And really hammer that home and make it a problem for Democrats if they try to do it any other way. And I think it is possible that he'll be able to prevail on that, just because the political logic is pretty strong, I think.
Speaking of political logic, Phil, what role would any possible impeachment trial in the Senate play in that?
Well, I think that from a sequencing standpoint, if the House does vote out an impeachment, and that does look likely right now, they're not going to do it until after votes on a potential USMCA and the year-end funding and any year-end tax bills that they do. I think that they're going to want to get any substantive work they're doing done first, and then sort of their last order of business will be they do the impeachment and go home, and then the Senate sort of starts next year on that.
All right. Well, it's just this is the stuff that just, I think, frustrates the American people, because when you look at the $17 trillion trust fund that is our tax collections every year, and they're going to get another batch of that every year, these folks, if they were actually a private equity firm, would be out of business for the bad investments they seem to send money off to.
Well, and worse than that, they never seem to admit it. He'll extend these things forever, and even if we're not really seeing any value from a taxpayer perspective, because every government program creates a constituency that really, really, really cares about it, the people who benefit from it, and the costs, of course, are diffuse over all of the taxpayers. It's much harder to organize those to push back against it, and that's why these government programs tend to last forever.
I was just looking at your piece on the and it just keeps staring at me, the $5 billion for environmental justice, college campuses, and I can
in a tax bill. Yeah, I don't know. It is. It's totally shameless.
This one screams campaign rhetoric, because I can see anyone who votes against this or tries to get this taken out will be immediately campaigned against as somebody who's cutting money to our universities, even though that, because we all know the ads never get into the
kids. Well, I kind of think that maybe they put that in just so they could take it out and sort of see we compromise. It's so crazy. But you never know with these Democrats. I'm sure they really want it.
Oh, good God. If it gets through, I mean, kiss the next generation goodbye. I mean, because they'll all come out of school making AOC seem learned and level-headed.
Well, unfortunately, I think a lot of these programs already exist and are already well funded. But $5 billion is a lot of money to throw on the pile.
It absolutely is. Phil, what else are you guys working on at American Commitment, or is this kind of the focal point of what your research has been focused in on, and or are there other?
Well, we're working on a few other things. We're very concerned about the Democratic approach to the drug pricing issue. They basically want to adopt the most draconian possible price controls, and Nancy Pelosi's bringing that bill to the floor, and Republicans actually have a pretty good alternative to that. And so that, I think, is sort of the leading edge of their efforts to have a total government takeover of the healthcare sector. And if you do it first with prescription drugs, people kind of think, hey, this is great, I'm paying less for drugs. What they don't see are the 100 new miracle cures that don't get developed because government has come in and set the prices. And so that's a big focus of ours. We're also sort of related to that, focused on exposing how AARP has now become little more than the marketing arm of United Healthcare, and they pretty much carry the United Healthcare banner in all of these policy debates, which is why they're pushing for the drug price controls, even though they obviously were against the interests of seniors who would benefit from all those cures that are going to be lost. And we're also, we continue to work on kind of all the issue areas we traditionally do. So we're working on some tech policy spectrum issues at the FCC. And, of course, we continue to be pushing really hard to try to get the administration to index the capital gains tax for inflation, which has been kind of one of our major focuses for the last year and a half. And that does, unfortunately, appear stalled right now, but we haven't given up on it.
Well, keep up the good work. I know that the drug pricing, that was the last time you were on with us, and folks can go and search that visit out because there was some concern at the time that the president was going along with Nancy Pelosi's idea of just, taking over the market and saying, do it. We'll just charge Canada's prices and putting in price controls, which I don't think have ever worked anywhere.
Well, his own economist, the White House Council of Economic Advisors, did a very compelling study that found that the Pelosi bill would prevent the development of 100 new cures from coming to the U.S. market. And so let's hope the president reads his own economist's report and that he finds that as compelling as I do.
AmericanCommitment.org is where you find them. Phil, thank you so much. President of American Commitment, author of Democracy Denied as well. But I appreciate your visit. If I don't talk to you before then, have a Merry, Merry Christmas, and thank you for joining us.
All right. Same to you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us. I know that wasn't very much of a happy note to wrap up on this week, but these are real things, and these are things that whether it's Morgan Griffith or Denver Riggleman or even Abigail Spanberger or wherever you're living in the Commonwealth, get with your representatives and say $5 billion to education to teach green environmentalism. Not just no, but hell no, perhaps is the phrase that pays. Until next week, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.